Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's a real honor to present here today, talk a bit about my book and a bit about how I see developments since my book and the geopolitics that we see going on around us all the time. So this is my book, Volt Rush. It covers the supply chain of batteries and some of the history and some of the geopolitics. I'd like to start today with a bit of the history, because I think it's important to remember how long clean energy technologies have been around. I don't know if anyone recognizes this man. This is Thomas Edison. He's was one of the most prolific American inventors. When we think of Edison, we probably think of this, the light bulb, amongst his many other inventions. But in the book, I argue that we should think about him in terms of batteries, because Edison actually spent many years of his life and millions of his own money trying to invent a better battery. And he did succeed in coming out with the nickel-iron alkaline storage battery. And we all know this man, Henry Ford, the greatest automotive tycoon of the 20th century. But not many people know his wife actually drove an electric at the time. This is a Detroit Electric, which was very popular with women. And Ford and Edison teamed up to try and create an electric vehicle. And this is the only photo of this prototype in the Ford archives. And you can see Edison's batteries under the seat. And over 100 years ago, electric vehicles became incredibly close to succeeding. This is a graph showing a number of models, number of producers, and real prices. Electric vehicles are in green, black gasoline, and red steam. And you can see in all these metrics, electric vehicles came very close. So it's one of those real historical what-if moments. And what's so interesting about it is, at the time, people thought electrics could be used for inner-city transport, and there was even a company in New York that sort of leased electric vehicles. But fossil fuels took over every mode of transport, and EVs were consigned to the dustbin, essentially. And if you look at other clean energy technologies, this is one of the first wind turbines used to generate electricity. This is 1888. Charles Brush in America built this wind turbine in his backyard, and it charged a number of batteries in his laboratory in his basement. A year earlier, in Scotland, James Blythe also developed a wind turbine to generate electricity. So these are really quite old technologies that have taken us a long time. One of the unfortunate things is, after that initial burst of enthusiasm, as I said, fossil fuels took over every form of transport. We entered the oil age and the geopolitics of the oil age, which I argue in my book sort of left a long scar over the 20th century. And we saw a number of geopolitical implications, the rise of the Middle East. But now we're entering the clean energy age, finally, after many, many years. And I'm very interested in the geopolitics of this clean energy age. And in the book, I look at one of the key technologies, which is batteries. Because if you're talking about replacing the 2 billion cars on the road, we're going to need a lot of batteries. If you're talking about energy storage, helping intermittent renewable energy integrate into the grid, we're also going to need a lot of batteries. So today, I'll just briefly talk about three things that I think are important. This energy transition is creating new winners and losers. This is happening very, very quickly. Much quicker than I thought. Why raw materials are the key bottleneck. This is something where I work now, benchmark mineral intelligence, we spend a lot of time looking at. And third, what happens to costs when you reshore some of these supply chains at a time of high inflation? Since my book came out, we've seen this issue come to the very top of the political agenda, and real efforts to try and localize and reshore these supply chains, and I'll talk a bit about that as well. So just first, the new winners and new losers. We're seeing all sorts of countries become very important in terms of clean energy and clean energy supply chains. I list some of them in this list. Australia, obviously, for the minerals. Canada, likewise. Indonesia for the nickel. Countries like Democratic Republic of Congo for the cobalt they have. Chile and Argentina for lithium. Europe and Sweden as well. I was just recently in Sweden, and there's a lot of activity there around battery production, anode production, and sodium-ion batteries. But at the heart of this transition is the China and the US and the relationship between these two superpowers. And in many senses, a lot of these other countries are trying to find their place in this new, what's been called a new Cold War between China and the US. Do they try to hedge themselves between these two countries, or do they align fully with the US? We've seen Canada take steps to forcibly expel Chinese companies from investment in Canadian lithium and really align with the US efforts to promote new supply chains. Australia also has done that. But countries like Indonesia, Argentina, Chile, they're much more, they're much more open to Chinese investment and supplying China. And for a lot of developing countries, the China-US sort of conflict, they don't necessarily see that as their conflict. They want the benefits of the energy transition, they want the jobs, economic development, but they would much rather the West spends money helping them combat climate change, helping them develop their economies, rather than help the US and China essentially fight each other and try to disentangle their economies. So when we look at the battery supply chain, it goes all the way from extraction to the electric vehicle. But the crucial thing is there's a number of steps in between. And as Scott mentioned earlier, developing a new mine, I put at the bottom the timescales. He said 15 years, it can take longer. So there's a fundamental mismatch between the time it takes to develop the mines and then the other steps in the supply chain. In China now, they can build chemical processing, cathode and battery cell manufacturing in about a year, actually much quicker than I put here. So they can really build these plants extremely quickly, but it's the mines that is the sort of limiting factor in terms of time it takes to develop them. Battery demand obviously was around 1 terawatt hour, I think, last year. It's going to more than triple this decade, but you can really see how electric vehicles are really going to be the dominant driver of lithium-ion battery demand. And this is quite key when you think about new technologies, especially energy storage technologies that might offer greater potential different materials, but can they compete on costs with the EV batteries because of the sheer scale of battery production that's going to electric vehicles? Longer term, we're looking at hundreds of terawatt hours that we need for this energy transition to get to net zero. I think Elon Musk says around 200 to 300 terawatt hours, so 20 terawatt hours a year. That's a sort of longer term view, but it gives you an idea of the scale of battery production that we need, from 1 terawatt hour up to 20 terawatt hours. And the implications on raw materials are really quite significant. With lithium, around 12 million tons, up from around 1 million tons at the moment. So we're really in the early stages of this energy transition. And the sheer scale of, as I said, those 2 billion cars on the road, and then you add in the energy storage demand as well. We did a rough calculation at Benchmark, taking the average mine size. How many mines would you need? It's over 300 new mines to meet demand by 2035. And the interesting thing is, by 2035, even if you take recycling into account, there's not that much difference. We do need these new mining assets. As we come to later in the decade, we are going to see shortages in lithium, nickel, and cobalt. So we need, if you take into account how long it takes to build these mines, we need that investment now to get that supply at the end of the decade. Just talking about China's dominance, I think it's really key to stress where China is dominant and where it's not. China's really extremely dominant on the processing side and the cathode and anode production and battery cell production. But the raw materials, it's actually still very reliant on imports, like it is for oil and gas. So if you think of China's perspective, they need to secure these raw materials outside their borders, yet they face an increasingly hostile world. As I said, Canada has stopped Chinese companies from investing in lithium, and we're probably going to see more of the same. So they need these raw materials to feed the other sectors, the industrial sectors that provide the jobs and economic opportunity in China. So that's why we do see Chinese investment in African lithium, lithium in Argentina, etc. And also the development of domestic lithium within China. China is really thinking of energy security, as is Europe and the US. So for them, a combination of coal, which they have domestically, coal plus renewables, charging electric vehicles will help them reduce their oil import. So whatever they can do to get more raw materials, they need that. And likewise, flipping it around, for the West, where we are really vulnerable is the processing side and the cathode and anode side, whereas the mines, Australia is obviously a key Western ally, and Canada has mines, but it's really these other steps that are energy intense, require a lot of technical expertise, and are very difficult to compete with China on costs that are the West's vulnerability. And China has what I would call excessive dominance in some areas. Rare earths and rare earth magnets is one, but anode and graphite is another. I think this is receiving more attention now. But if you look at sort of anode capacity being built and forecast to be built, China's dominance is set to remain throughout this decade into the early part of next decade. So I think if the West wants to de-risk, it should really focus on these areas where China's dominance is 90+%, and the West can de-risk to slightly reduce that dominance, rather than focusing on areas where China is only 50% of the market. It's really anode and rare earths where China is really highly dominant. This is a picture of Xi Jinping visiting a cathode plant in Hunan recently. It was his first visit after the National People's Congress. And I think it really signifies to me how China and how Xi is going to continue to support those areas where China has dominance and really put its pedal to the metal to increase those areas. They fit perfectly into his view of new productive forces, high-tech manufacturing. So we shouldn't be surprised in the West, that China will respond to our efforts to de-risk, our efforts to reduce reliance on China, and they will continue to expand investment and capacity. If you look at another area where China is dominant, PCAM, which is the precursor material. So once you've processed the materials, you need to produce PCAM before it goes into the cathode. Again, we see China 90% capacity out to 2035. So this is yet another area where China's dominance is really extreme. And China has not only become dominant, it's over-invested, and we've seen this year a lot of plants being idle or underutilized. But if you look at something like LFP cathode, there's massive overcapacity, and China could afford to supply the entire world with LFP cathode materials. So this is really putting pressure on prices just at the time when the West is trying to de-risk and trying to build its own supply chain. You can see LFP prices for LFP cathode material have fallen quite significantly. So good news for electric vehicles, but makes it more difficult for the West to de-risk. Longer term, we think raw materials are important. As I said, they're one of the key bottlenecks because we still see NCM batteries, nickel, cobalt, manganese batteries playing a significant role for longer range vehicles, for premium vehicles, and for markets like the US where people want more range. So we do see, despite the rise in LFP, that we will see both chemistries maintaining dominance. And this has huge implications for countries like Indonesia, which, as I said earlier, is very dominant in nickel. They're going to play a really key role this decade. Yeah, US back in the game. I'll just talk a bit about the Inflation Reduction Act and how significant a piece of legislation this is. This wasn't in my book. It came out after my book was published. But, growing up, we became so used to the US never doing anything when it came to climate legislation. And Obama had very similar goals in terms of stimulating clean energy technologies in the US, getting the jobs from the energy transition, but he couldn't quite manage to get Congress to pass legislation. So the IRA is extremely significant. Not a single Republican vote, but they still managed to get this legislation passed. And what we see in the IRA is very protectionist measures and very similar to how China has developed its clean energy industries. So it's like the US trying to outdo China. And in particular, this is when it comes to critical minerals, you can get the 3,750 tax credit. So when someone buys an EV, they can get money off the EV purchase price. But the materials have to be mined or processed in North America or free trade agreement countries. And more significantly, they introduced a rule saying foreign entities of concern cannot be involved in this supply chain, China being the most significant entity of concern. And they further defined this as a foreign entity of concern is a company where 25% or more is owned by a company linked to the state of Chinese state or government or based in China. And this really brings to the heart the challenges of localizing these supply chains, because many countries don't have FTAs with the US, and in addition, the rule on foreign entity of concern is a rule that the US can't really win because it either creates loopholes that they can be accused of using taxpayer funds to benefit China, or they're too strict and not enough EVs get the tax credit, therefore defeating the very objective of Biden's rule. So here you can see why. I mean, when it comes to nickel, we forecast only 13% IRA compliant, 73% coming from Indonesia, China, and Russia. And if you look at cobalt supply, it's very similar, 83%, DRC, and Indonesia is becoming a big producer. So countries without an FTA with the US. And if you look at the processing side, nickel sulfate, most of it would be classed as foreign entity concerns or processed within China. And cobalt, the same, process within China. When it comes to lithium, similarly, while lithium's extracted in South America, Australia, China really has quite a dominant portion of the processing. But within that portion, a lot is owned or invested in by American companies, such as Albemarle or Livent, or now what's called Arcadium Lithium. And those assets, because they're within China, would count as a foreign entity of concern, even though they're invested by an American company. And the cost difference is huge. Arcadium Lithium said they built lithium processing in China for $20 million for a new plant, and they said in the US that would cost $200 million. So we can see a 10 times cost difference. And we're seeing at the same time as these these IRA restrictions coming in, that costs are increasing for a lot of projects in the West. So how do we compete with China? I'll just offer a few thoughts. I do think innovations that are low cost and more sustainable are the way to go. We can't have innovations that add to the costs. We need to have innovations that can somehow cut the costs of processing or enable the West to have some sort of cost advantage. Using hydropower, using renewable energy can help to lower the carbon footprint and potentially cut costs. And government subsidies, of course. We need to see some sort of political continuity to maintain the support for this sector and somehow make sure it's not vulnerable to electoral cycles or domestic politics. And I think that's really key. Eventually, we could create new supply chains where, unlike now, where everything goes to China, everything's shipped to China, and electric vehicles are shipped back to Europe. We could see minerals from Australia go to Europe to be processed, or from elsewhere. So that's sort of the vision and the hope, but it's not going to be easy to get there. Technological innovation, as I said, something like direct lithium extraction could improve the yield, improve the efficiency of lithium extraction, but also unlock lithium in North America or other areas that, again, could help the West build up these supply chains. I talked about government subsidies being important. What we're also seeing is friendshoring and the idea that countries can come together to compete with China. It's not as simple as it sounds, and the Inflation Reduction Act caused a lot of backlash in Europe. and a lot of investments that were going to be made in Europe have gone to the US. So there are tensions in this arrangement. But this, I think, is a way to, a strategy to pursue, because if all these countries get together, there is enough there to create new supply chains and really focus on the task. And real money is starting to come out to mining. I think Scott mentioned earlier the DOE loan to Lithium Americas for lithium processing. But this is big money, right? This is real money. Australia has also given recent loans to Liontown Resources and a rare earths company as well. So we're seeing real money come out for the first time into these projects. And I talked about clean energy, hydropower. Quebec is another area that's becoming a cluster due to the low carbon footprint of its hydropower. Sorry, just talk about this a bit, which is another thing that needs to happen is somehow for markets to reward the carbon footprint of Western production or more sustainable production. We're not there yet. At the moment, automotive companies won't pay a premium for more sustainable supply or battery production. But I think eventually we could get to a situation where a slight premium emerges, and that's the kind of thing that would also help drive Western build-out of supply chains. And recycling as well. If you think about it, at the moment, China's exporting all these lithium-ion batteries and EVs to Europe and the US. They are, in essence, giving us these materials that have been processed in China that we can then use and recycle. So if we can keep hold of the batteries that we import and the EVs that are within Europe, then we can get a hold of quite significant resources in the future, 2030s plus. In addition, as we build out these supply chains, we're going to generate a huge amount of process scrap, waste scrap from all these gigafactories that we can also use in the near term. And we forecast 78%, I think, by 2025 will come from this process scrap from gigafactories. Final thought also is, do we use this energy transition to rethink mobility, think about how we get around? Are we going to choose the Ford F-150 pickup truck on the left, which has a big nickel-heavy battery, or the Wuling Mini on the right, which uses no nickel and cobalt and much less lithium? If you had smaller battery pack sizes, you could potentially avert the whole lithium deficit. This was an exercise that we did. So that's really powerful, especially for Europe, where you do see mini electric vehicles and you do see SUVs, you see all variety. If you build out the charging infrastructure, then we can try to enable smaller cars with smaller battery packs. China's really cracked that mass market, smaller EVs, and I think Europe and the US, what we need to see is that mass market electric vehicle. As Elon Musk has said, we're between these two waves, where the next stage is mass market, cheap EVs, and we need to get consumers to accept them and to support them. So just in conclusion, I think we're well on our way to this energy transition, but I do think the geopolitics and the politics domestically are really of high concern and are worth following closely, because we need to, in Western democracies, we need to get buy-in from populations for this project of de-risking from China and building out these supply chains, and we need to get the public support. Because we're already seeing, because China is so dominant, we're already seeing voices coming out against EVs because they say it will lead us to reliance on China. So we're in a very dangerous area where in the West we need to maintain this vision and this strategy that we've embarked on and not give up. So thank you very much for having me. Sure.